So I titled this video Gains from Trade, and then CS stands for Consumer Surplus and PS stands for Producer Surplus. So the title of this is Gains from Trade, Consumer Surplus and Producer Surplus. But the real point of this video is to answer the question, why trade? The entire world now trades with each other, and we trade an amazing amount of products on a daily basis all over the world. We have all these ships and planes flying and running around, and there's a big reason for it, and this is the explanation for that in terms of economics. So the short answer is we trade because it makes everyone better off. But we're going to go ahead and talk about how much better off and kind of give an explanation from an economics perspective of why we're all better off. So I just went ahead and took the Chinese and the American toy market from our example. I think it was 3 videos ago. I'm not exactly sure. And first, before we can start on anything new, we're just going to do some review, and we're going to talk about the situation before trade. So before trade, I'm just going to go ahead and take this demand line up here just so that the pictures will be a little bit better. And I'm going to put a D there so you remember that. And I'm going to do the same thing over here for America. So all I'm doing here is that because of limited space, I kind of cut off these graphs, and so I'm just extending them so that it'll look more like something that you're familiar with in 1 second. And then I'll just go ahead and put supplies right here. And so I want to talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus before trade. So in the Chinese market, the equilibrium will be at about $3. It's not exactly $3 if I remember correctly, but that's close enough. So this will be the equilibrium price, and the equilibrium quantity will be, it looks around 75, but this will be the equilibrium quantity. I don't know exactly what it is, and for our purposes it doesn't matter this time. So then the consumer surplus is the area below demand and above the price. And remember, the reasoning here goes, this demand line means that there is one person here that is willing to pay, it looks like $9 for their toy. So that person in China is willing to pay $9 for their toy, but they only have to pay $3. So they get $6 worth of benefit for this market existing. They get $6 worth of surplus. And then the same thing for the next guy, and the same thing for the next guy, and the same thing for the next guy. And then what we do is we assume all of these little in-between points are also people. So we assume that every single little one of these, little microscopic pixels represents a person. And so we end up coloring in this entire thing. And so that is the Chinese consumer surplus before. And I'm just going to put a B there so that we remember this is the before scenario. And we're going to get to the after scenario down here when we introduce trade. So this is before trade. I should put that here. Before trade. Okay. And then Chinese producer surplus, is the area above supply and below price. Because the thinking here goes, there's one producer in China that would be willing to make toys for, it looks like, $1, but he gets to sell his toys for $3. And so the same thing goes on, and we end up coloring in this entire triangle. So this is the producer surplus before. And so now we're going to go do the exact same thing in the American market, and we're going to go ahead and say, I remember from before that this was $15 was our equilibrium price. So this was P, and that was 15, but we aren't going to use numbers here, so don't even worry about that. And so then the consumer surplus, in America will be this triangle. That will be the consumer surplus before. And then let me grab a different color. This triangle will be the producer surplus in America before. So all of that should be a review. Up until this point, we've done nothing new, and if you aren't remembering this, go back and check out the videos on consumer and producer surplus before we go on in this video. So if you don't get this, just pause and go back. But now we're going to talk about what happens after trade, and this is the new part. So if you remember, and the key thing to notice right here is there's a big after. This is after trade. So if we open up the toy market to trade between China and the US, we got a world market that had an equilibrium at, let me just grab a different color, at $8. So this is the price for the world, and I'm just going to put P with a little W above it. And so that's the price that the USA and the Chinese are going to pay for their toys. So we're just going to go ahead and, as straight as I can possibly draw, just take this line all the way over. So this is going to be the price in the US now, and it's also going to be the price in China. And if this is confusing you, we did this all in a prior video. So go back, I think it's 3 videos ago, but it's the beginning of the 2 large nation model. So go back and have a look at those if what I'm doing right here doesn't kind of ring a bell. And so this will be the price for China also. And what's happening is now the USA and China can trade freely. So the USA gets toys a little bit cheaper because they're importing from China, and the Chinese get to sell toys at a more expensive price because they can now sell them or export them to the USA. So the world market now sets the price because we have free trade. And now we're going to go ahead and examine how consumer surplus and producer surplus in both China and America are affected after trade. So after trade, and I'm going to just scroll up for a second so I keep the colors the same. We had purple and yellow for China. So after trade, the world price now sets the price for toys in the Chinese market. So hold on, I just need to make one little, just need to extend that so that we get a triangle rather than just something that cuts off. And we'll make that demand, and I'm going to do the same over here. So that's demand. And then I'm just prettifying or just making these drawings look more familiar to you guys. Okay, so back to what I was saying. Now in the world market sets the price because we have open trade between China and the US. So toys cost $8 in China and toys cost $8 in the USA. So the Chinese consumer surplus now is smaller because toys are more expensive. So this is the Chinese consumer surplus after. And then the difference, though, is that the Chinese producer surplus is now gigantic. So the Chinese producer surplus before was this little triangle right here, but now it's this entire triangle because the price has been greatly increased due to trade. So everything under the pink line and above the red line now is the Chinese producer surplus after. And we're going to go ahead and compare the before and after in just 1 second. So then in America, we did green and orange. In America now, the consumer surplus is going to be the area below the demand line and above price, which is this entire triangle. And the producer surplus is going to be the area above the red line, above supply, and below price, which will be this triangle. So we have American producer surplus after, and we have American consumer surplus after. And now the trick is to compare the before and the after. So we want to know, basically, is the world better off or worse off for trade? And so if we look at China, we see that before, China had a consumer surplus of this right here, this triangle. You know what, I'll go ahead and do that in black so you can see it. This triangle was its consumer surplus, and this triangle was its producer surplus, for a total surplus of this entire triangle. Now if we go down here to the after, we see that China still has this entire triangle of surplus. That is what they had before trade. It's split up a little differently, but they still have that entire triangle, and we're going to talk about how it was split up in a second. But what they gained from trade, and this is the whole reason that we talk about trade and why economists love trade so much, the gains from trade are this entire triangle. So this is all extra surplus that China gained just from trading with the US, just from opening up its borders to trade. Or maybe the US opened up its borders. So this is the gains from trade, and I'm just going to write gains from trade right here. Now if you said, well, China gained from trade, the US must have lost. That is actually not the case, and that's why economists love free trade. So we're going to go up here and look at the USA, and we're going to see that their total surplus before trade was this triangle that I'm outlining in black right here. And if we go down to the after scenario, we still see that the US has that same exact amount of total surplus, but they also gained from trade. They gained this whole triangle. So this is the US gains from trade, and I'm just going to write gains here. So both China and the US are better off for trade, and here's how. The Chinese get to sell their toys at a more expensive price. So the Chinese lose a little bit of consumer surplus, and we can see that from the difference between the purple here and the purple here. So the Chinese consumers are worse off after trade. Chinese consumers are, I'm just going to put a little worse off, are a little worse off after trade. Because by opening their borders, the Chinese producers now are sending most of their toys overseas to the USA, which is increasing the price that Chinese consumers have to pay. So the other part of that is that the Chinese producers are way better off. Way better off. And we can see that by the difference between this huge yellow triangle, which is the producer surplus after for China, and this little teeny yellow triangle, which was the producer surplus before. So the big point here is that Chinese producers, and I'm going to change colors just kind of for the emphasis here. So Chinese producers gain more than Chinese consumers lose. And that's the real kicker to trade here, is that the producers are way better off and the consumers are only a little bit worse off. So as a whole, the Chinese total surplus increases. And just the opposite happens in the US. In the US, before the price was $15 per toy. So the US producer now is losing surplus because the price went from $15 to $8. So you can see that the orange triangle here is now smaller. And if this is going too slow, feel free to skip it, but I think it's important to actually write this down. So the US producer is actually going to be a little worse off because the price of toys fell. Sorry, US producer is a little worse off. At the same time, the American consumer is way better off, and we can see that as the growth of this green triangle. So green went from this little thing up here to this gigantic one up here. So the US consumer is is way better off. And so the exact same thing that was true for China is also true for the US with a little bit of a twist. So the US consumer gained more than the producer lost in surplus. So the net effect for both nations is that total surplus, and I'm just going to write TS, total surplus increased. We are all better off for trading. So to generalize this, rather than talking about the Chinese market and the USA market, we could talk about any general exporter. I'm just going to cross that out and write an exporter, and then I'm going to cross out USA and I'm going to write an importer. So whenever something is opened up to trade, in the exporting nation, the consumers will be a little bit worse off and the producers will be way better off, and they're exporters. And in the importing nation, the consumers will be way better off and the producers will just be a little bit worse off. But as a whole, in any situation, we believe, the gains from trade outweigh the losses in either the producer side over here or the consumer side over here. So trade makes everyone better off, and the takeaway from this video really is being able to work with the consumer and producer surplus diagrams, these ones over here, when we're talking about trade, because you're going to need to be able to do that a lot in this section coming up. So that's a pretty long video already, and I'm going to end it there, and I'll see you in the next one.